I owe you an apology, my friends. Since last we gathered, mischief and malice made a meal of me. Stolen by a dragon, nearly pulled apart by an overlord's delight in cruelty, and hurled from the sky when my faithful eagle unravelled mid-flight inside a wild magic squall. Travel soured in me bones after that, but some tales refused to wait, and this one pressed its hands to me chest and would not let me rest. So, back we go to the very cusp where we left our heroes balanced between question and answer. This man's pocket, yes, literally, held the children of the Crescent Moon as gently as a teacup holds heat. It was a parlour of reprieve rather than an interrogation, an introduction more than an inquest. They drank, and they listened, and they watched a particularly sentient teacup glare at the rogue with the hopeless devotion of an offended butler. But they came away with more riddles than revelations, and then, as if the pocket itself exhaled, they were returned to the stone and shadow, and the weight of the Forge of Fury. There, grandeur embraced silence. Before them sprawled a tomb vast as a chapel and exacting as a ledger. Obsidian and marble met in sober conversation. Filigree traced the walls like hammered constellations. Statues kept their watch with patient eyes. And at the centre lay a golden sarcophagus, serene and lifelike, as if remembering the shape of a breath it would never draw. The air was heavy, with a pulse felt more than heard, as though memory itself had been trapped beneath the lid and wished, lightly, be let out. The party searched the room, and they read the meaning in the inlay, story in the stone, omen in the stillness. Yet the room kept its secrets, as if waiting for a single word that would unlock the rest. Politeness, alas, is not always precision. The fighter, earnest in his courtesy and thunderous in his volume, called to the sarcophagus, "Please, open." The room did not open. It recoiled. A spine-crack burst of sound split the air. The torchlight lurched to a blue-black snarl. The floor shivered, not with welcome, but with warning. The illusion did not peel away. It tore. Walls fractured like panes of glass kicked by an angry god. Parchment became a storm. Bones, smoke, and shredded text rose in a spiral of unbound knowledge. Towering shelves elbowed their way from impossible angles. Corridors multiplied where none could fit, and the repository revealed not its contents, but its hunger. From that squall of script, a shape cohered. Letters knitting into tendon, pages hardening into bone. A scholar's robe hung in tatters from a towering skeleton. Ink bled from hollow eyes and pooled at its feet. An iron staff ringed with chains of broken oaths struck the stone with a pulse of necrotic will. And when it spoke, it did not do so alone. 100 voices braided into one, the furious, the sorrowing, and the forgotten. The unworthy are not welcome. Do not acknowledge you defile it. You will not leave here with ignorance. You will not leave at all. And with that, so began battle with the Eternal Archivist. Leol, who by now had discovered his true name, Leol, was a deft arcane trickster, moved first, tracing the sigils of Booming Blade. The focus snagged on turbulence and the spell slipped wide and cracked against the stone beyond the hovering horror. The Archivist answered in iron poetry. His spectral chains lashed at the fighter, ethereal and yet shockingly real. Blinks bit and pain bloomed, and still, by grit and angle, he twisted free before the shackles could cinch together. However, a withered hand lifted towards Leol. Unintelligible syllables pressed like ice behind his eyes, and the world tilted, pain arcing through his skull. The spell was called Binding Script, but he shook off its cruder claws and managed to keep his voice. The party's archivist, alchemist of sound and scholar of spell, let fall a whisper sharpened to a blade. and dissonant whispers slid under the archivist's ribs. It flinched, not frightened but touched, like a bell struck at a distance. But the fighter stepped through that window, his blade, ambracrism, is an argument made of adamantine and obsidian, a relic and a premonition. He set it deep into the archivist's side, and with that strike he laid the unwavering mark. Chaining duty to fury, attend to me, or be punished for turning away. Magnus, by this time, who had also begun to know himself, was the party's cleric of the twilight hour, and he entered a room of death, a dusk-lit prayer. Twilight sanctuary unfurled like a cool breath, pain dulled, and hearts steadied. And life took one deliberate step back from that cliff. Fate, meanwhile, made its own edits. The air around the druid and the ranger shivered with a remnant of the astral sea, a faint rift-like breath taken through the veil. Their silhouettes stretched thin as starlight, then the shimmer snapped shut. Where comrades had once stood, motes now drifted like dust made of memory. Mid-fight, the party had lost 2 pillars, not to death, but to the untidy margins of reality. Caught off guard, Leo faltered another heartbeat, and an arrow wandered where intention did not. Chains, however, answered again, striking the fighter, but the bite refused to bind, and the party's archivist pressed the cord, once again dissonant whispers, and this time the music ended through. The Eternal Archivist recoiled, unthinking, and fled its center, straight into a corner it had not meant to choose. The fighter pursued hard. The first swing skidded off the air. The angle was wrong, distance was poor. He breathed, found his second wind, and surged, hammering back with renewed curiosity, reasserting the mark, daring the foe to meet him, eye to empty eye. And Magnus moved to seal the corner and set the second threat. His spiritual weapon, an invisible will with a hammer's weight, hovered, and in his hands he revealed his new devotion, the fury of the Ashen King, a warhammer of few stone and story, its veins of ember light promising ruin. The blow whistled past. This time, the Eternal Archivist seized the instant, spit out a legendary syllable, word of unmaking. The spell passed through the fighter like a moth through cloth. Quiet. And then you could see the hole. The fighter fought, but his habits were frayed, and the mark unraveled. In a rush to assist, Leo's bow tangled with his belt and sent a shaft astray. His luck was not holding true this day. The Eternal Archivist, cornered and bleeding ink, made the chains sing again, this time strikes that rattled the ribs, and yet restraint still would not hold. Its spell that followed faltered, ink light gathering like a candle in the wind. In came a dart from the party's archivist, and it kissed the skull, but missed the brain of the thing that had none. Pain-fogged brain, the fighter's timing, another swing caught only the idea of an enemy, and Magnus gathered promise into the hammerhead. A breath held in iron, and saving that fire for the stroke that mattered. And then, listening closely to the weave, the Eternal Archivist turned his malice on Magnus. The world paused. The die in our mortal hands sat crooked. Reality demanded a fair cast. Before it fell, once again, Leo, soft voice, certain in heart, named the number 11, and the fate stone clattered, spun, and then settled on that very mark, as if the weave, amused or moved, decided it would be glorious just this once. However, the Eternal Archivist's attack went wide, not by chance, but by narrative. Theory curdled into something meaner. Magnus was caught by hold person as it lanced through the air, and was now locked like a statue of resolve, feeling the first hairline cracks. The party's archivist flung acid splash. A caustic sheen hissed across robe and rune, eating threads of the script where it landed, and the fighter answered with proof. Ambracrism carved a grievous line, the archivist's edges fuzzed, cohesion beginning to fail. and the room itself seemed to lean in closer, as if the repository wanted to see the ending written properly. While close, it was not to pass. Paralyzed, Magnus still commanded his echo, and spiritual weapon found purchase, and cracked a radiant seam across the archivist's frame. Leo, finally finding the seam he'd hunted for all night, loosed an arrow that went in mean and deep, the only kind a rogue can place, where bone must concede leverage. The library snarled, and the Eternal Archivist called on its lair. Shelves roared, and floors buckled. Shades of past scholars crawled from the boards, 3 of them placing themselves like clever footnotes in the worst possible margins to trouble archers and mages alike. The shudder knocked the fighter a breath off rhythm, and chains hammered him once again, and this time they cinched. Cold scripture locked his limbs, and the world pinwheeled into restraint. The archivist's second lash flew from the same chain and caught Magnus in his stillness. Skull grinned, finally learned happiness. However, the party's archivist ignored the shadow breathing down his neck and threw another acid splash. It landed, but unfortunately it lacked the earlier bite. The trick had been seen. The fighter, however, fought like a man chewing through rope, and he managed to break the chains, muscle, grit, and the last breath of Twilight Sanctuary pooling in his lungs like a promise kept. The new shades swung, hands of history grasping at the living. Some passed through bodies as though through fog, but 2 drew blood from Magnus and the party's archivist. Magnus, his jaw set, managed to tear free of the paralysis, though the effort stalled his action in the thread of his strength. The owl, however, read the table. He slipped a scholar's reach, slid up behind the archivist, daring it to look away from the fighter. Steel flashed, but the angle was wrong, and the point declared its intent to the air, and nothing else. However, the archivist was not fooled. It smelled blood and sought the fighter once again. Chains struck, but fate refused to bind. Then, a quill turned into a spike, and binding script slammed into the party's archivist. Pain, like negative thought, clawed inside his skull. Spell sealed his syllables. The man who weaponized the words found his mouth locked in archive. Still he fought, crossbow raised, bolt loosed, only to have a nearby shade bump his line and send the shot wide. The fighter answered with his life in his hands. He carved yet again, leaving the Eternal Archivist's form shattering, its edges unraveling like an old book in damp. The shades once again found a bit of rhythm, glancing hits, blood in the margin. But momentum had shifted. Magnus had enough. He called dusk into judgment. Turn on Dead rang like a temple bell cracked on purpose. One scholar graded its incorporeal, but held. 2 led the fight. And miracle of all miracles, the Eternal Archivist himself faltered, compelled to run once again, to flee, to study the corners as if the corners held absolution. The children of the Crescent Moon used the gift wisely. They smashed the one resisting shade into a mist, and then gathered, breathed, found wounds, shared draughts while their foes for once could do nothing but stare at stone and shake. It was a reprieve made of discipline, not luck, someone says. The repository itself, however, got jealous and coughed up more shades, as if to argue the cleric's verdict. Too late, however, as the company advanced with careful cruelty, refusing to jar the turned from their awe. They closed the ring around the Eternal Archivist. When their blows fell this time, they fell with the weight of all prior failures balanced on their backs. Ambraclism whispered ruin, and Leo's blade slid between ideas. The party's archivist, voiceless, made his hands speak, and Magnus, patient no longer, planted his feet, drew in the breath he had saved inside the fury of the Ashen King, and let it all out through iron. The hammer struck the skull, and bone, black ink, and burrowed voices collapsed into dust. Silence didn't return, It released. Shades screamed and blew away like ash in a bellows. Stone doors rose, thundering back into their vaults, and pedestals, racks, and shelves unfolded from shimmer into certainty. The final layer of the illusion gave up its last defense. Bowed. Footsteps hurried from the eastern corridor, scuffed, breathless, and humanoid. Tennell arrived first with his cloak a little theatrical in his haste. "There you are," he said. "Thank the gods." When the ground started to shake, we thought, well, never mind what we thought. And just then, Hallie barreled in, staff in one hand and a torn scroll in the other, voice sharp with adrenaline. The crypt, she said, was pulsing like it was about to collapse. We didn't know if it was sealing you in, or something was breaking out. However, the room's new heart pulled every gaze. It was a pedestal that waited in the center, and on it, a device, cousin to the artifacts the party had already chased across too many maps. A circular base, obsidian veined with bronze, rising in a gentle convex swell. Runes etched in an unbroken loop. Time, memory, and rebirth flowed like a sentence without a period. A 3-inch cradle held a semisphere, an opening brazier of overlapping petals, each etched in layered glyphs. Red and gold pulsed through it in time with that ancient heartbeat, like coals that refused to learn how to die. And above, the crown was air and not air, or a visible ripple. Heat haze holding fragments that orbited and refracted light as if the device were breathing light in and out. It was at this time, however, that the echo of measured steps followed through the corridor, and Dr. Donnell entered with dust along her hem and purpose in her eyes. She took in the aftermath, then the orbiting fragments, and allowed herself a single, steadying breath. "You found it," she said, and the next words wore command like a well-cut coat. "We will recover everything. Scrolls, tablets, crystalline stores, bound glyphwork. If it holds information, it comes with us. We must make space in the hold. And here, because I promised to treat my wounds with more respect than pride, we'll let the ink dry. The archivist is dust." The doors to the chamber were open. The device glows like a coal that remembers the sun. The children of the Crescent Moon stand in a room that nearly ate them, and now finally offers them its heart. But when I've caught my breath, I'll sing you the next verse. For yes, there is more yet to come.